All right, well, why don't we get started? We have another panelist who is scheduled to be with us, so hopefully Julie James will pop in. So I want to welcome our panelists this afternoon. We have Glenn Tapia, Brian Lovins, Charles Robinson, and I'm hoping Julie's here, Julie James. And each comes with a different perspective and a different role. And we wanted to have this particular panel because we wanted to talk about trends in the field, how the thoughts of social justice is influencing some of the work that people are doing. The concept of social justice is different than the concept of criminal justice. And in fact, in 2014, in a National Academy of Sciences report that Jeremy Travis, who, there it is, The Growth of Incarceration in the United States. My favorite chapter, chapter 12, elicits this notion that there should be 4 guiding principles for us to think about how our criminal legal system performs: parsimony, proportionality, citizenship, also a novel idea, and social justice. And for quite a bit of time, little has been done in the area of social justice. And so our theme here is social justice, given how we have come to where we are in 2022 in terms of our criminal legal system. So I'm going to let the panelists each introduce themselves very quickly, 2 sentences or less. I know that's hard because we have really accomplished, great people. And then we're going to start with some questions. This is a dialogue. Those of you in the audience, feel free to do a Q&A, and I'll be happy to share the questions with our panelists. So Glenn Tapia, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm from the state of Colorado, and this is my 34th year in the justice system, and most of that time has been spent on the corrections side, so happy to be here.
Thank you. Charles Robinson? Oh, Charles, we can't hear you.
That was a test. Okay, very good. I'm Charles Robinson. I am at the Administrative Office for the United States Courts. I am the Deputy Chief. I've been here, I think, about 10 years almost total. And before this, I was in the state system for a while, about 20 plus years, I guess, total experience.
All right, thanks, Charles. Julie James?
Thank you, Faye. It's so good to be here and to be in this crew and this awesome panel. My name is Julie James. I'm a Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, which is a private philanthropy working to maximize opportunity and minimize injustice. I oversee a team that does work on corrections issues. So this is, obviously really front and center for us, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Brian Lovins.
Thanks, Faye, and good afternoon, everyone. Brian Lovins. I'm a principal at Justice System Partners. We're a small nonprofit criminal justice research technical assistance group. I've been in the field for now going on 30 years. I've worked in Harris County as the assistant director of the probation department there, and then prior to that, the University of Cincinnati.
So we can basically see we have a quite well-seasoned panel. Everyone's outing themselves in terms of how long they've been doing this work. But given that we have a well-seasoned panel, what are your thoughts about this concept and principles of social justice as a way of thinking about the criminal legal system, criminal justice system, and how it is that we can be more effective in what we do as part of the criminal legal system? So does anyone want to start with their thoughts on social justice as a norm or principle as compared to criminal justice?
I'm happy to jump into the breach, Faye, and say I feel, I think, personal as well as professional obligation to really think about social justice. Rewind to the summer of 2020. I am sure that I'm not alone in saying that we looked hard at what we were doing and saying, what have we been missing and what can we do differently going forward? And how might that impact communities and the outcomes that we care about? You know, as you said, the criminal legal system has safety and accountability as some of its goals, but what about strengthening communities? And have we been sort of narrowing the scope too far in? Do we need to zoom out and think about that harm? So we thought a lot about social context. We thought a lot about history, and I think that's an important place to start. If we don't think about social context, we risk perpetuating or deepening social inequality. And what we're trying to do is on the back end, sort of address the accountability issues, but what if we're worsening some of the root causes? And I think that's, you know, where a lot of us landed to say, yeah, it's not a great spot to be in. And we really need to be more aware, get concrete about the history, not just numerical trends, not just individuals, but families and communities, and understand how policies changes in the past may have led to the present that we're in. I was going to talk about the principles that you lifted up, Faye, which is why I had the book right here. But that's been a guiding light for us to think about those principles and really also pulling out not just social justice, but racial justice specifically. So that's kind of my opening thoughts on that. And I know others are already off mute to respond as well.
I think, Faye, you know,
Go ahead,
for me,
Charles.
thinking about social justice as a principle frees us to really think about a new way of work. A lot of times when you talk about the criminal legal system, people want to make small tweaks. And I think where we are now is understanding that we're going to have to make significant systemic change. And I think when you think about social justice as a principle, you can almost imagine a different system, one that accounts for, I guess, the historic things that have impacted sort of the policies that we have now and the people that were in the room creating those policies and the absence of voice that might have existed when those policies are created and the disparities that we're learning are, I guess, coming from those policies. Thinking about social justice and the development and creation of a new system really allows us to, I guess, escape from or walk away from some of those things and think freely about the system we want. One that provides accountability but doesn't exacerbate some of the historical traumas that people have experienced.
Yeah, and you know, and from my perspective, I've been taking on this mindset lately, you know, in the justice system, when we've been thinking kind of narrowly about the criminal justice sphere, it's kind of this echo chamber that we live in without really thinking of this larger construct. And, you know, we talk about recidivism all the time and trying to reduce recidivism and all this kind of stuff. And I'm beginning to think that the justice system isn't fair until it's just as easy to get out of the system as it is to get in the system. And when we've been talking about, you know, this 50% recidivism rate and all these failures, it makes me think that it's so easy to get in the system and so hard to get out. And until we start thinking outside the echo chamber of the justice system and start thinking about social justice, we can't really start. We have to start thinking about that, to start thinking about why is it so easy to get entrapped in the justice system and so hard to get out. And that 50% recidivism rate is evidence of that thinking, I believe. And so I'm really with Julie about kind of going back to that, you know, summer of 2020 perspective and really just reimagining what we really think. And, you know, much like Charles is saying, asking different questions and different people about, you know, why are we so awful at what we do? Candidly speaking, why are we so ineffective at what we're trying to do? Because we have proven time and time again that we're not very good at what we do. Corrections, if our job is to correct, we're not doing a very good job of it. And there's lots of answers to those questions from my perspective, but we're not very good at it. And so I think we have to start asking different questions and asking different people why we're not very good at what we do. So, and I think that requires us to be thinking about social justice. So those are my initial thoughts.
All right, great. Brian?
And I really appreciate folks' thoughts. I echo many of the ones that we just heard, so not repeating. I think there's two themes for me. The first one is that the way I see social justice is the criminal justice system has actually threatened social justice for its entire existence. You know, you look at all the areas of social justice, and the criminal justice system creates and disrupts those social elements, right? Communities, healthcare, racial injustices, right? The criminal justice system has been an enactor of all of that throughout time, right? We've busted communities up by incarcerating and over-incarcerating fathers, people of color, taking people out of their communities that didn't need to be there. We've criminalized substance use issues and mental health issues and incarcerated them. And so I see the criminal justice system as a driver to create injustices in social. And then the second piece, I think, is actually the underlying thread for me is we're a country that believes in the fabric of our country is pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and that whatever happened to you does not impact your individual decision making, and that at all costs or at any cost, we are individual actors that do not work within systems. And I think the problem is we're starting to become acutely aware that people don't act independent of the system, that the system actually impacts their decision making or operates like they're independent, but don't give them, but operates at different levels, right? So we know we have good research to support that white people use and sell drugs at greater capacity or greater per capita than Black people, but 7 times more likely to go to prison for drug use are Black people, right? So like that to me is this idea that at the individual level, we hold people accountable, but really our social systems have created the environment where we need with food apartheid and job apartheids, people need to engage in things that we've now criminalized.
Well, I think you all have basically spoken to the fact that, you know, a social justice lens to quote collectively, but quote Julie, opens our eyes to being able to shift our premise from just focusing in on what's happening in the criminal legal system, but more so asking the question that Glenn asked, which is, you know, if it's so easy to get in, but you can't get out, there must be something wrong that the system is maintaining itself. And that, Brian and Charles, you both spoke to the fact that we need systemic change and we shouldn't be tinkering at the edge, which is, to a large extent what we've done with our reforms. I mean, if you read the 1967 President Johnson's Commission on the Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, the same themes are in that report as we're talking about now. And, through most of my career, people have talked about. So what are your ideas about some of these systemic changes to do different than what we currently have done? I know, hard question.
So I would start with the principle and on the criminal justice side, right? Not on the social justice side, but from a criminal justice perspective, I would start with the principle that the punishment, that the response to crime is the conviction, and that everything that falls after the conviction is designed to help people be successful, and that we don't have that. We have tripwires, we've got setups, we've got systems that are, to Glenn's point, impossible to get out of. We've got people that we identify as having serious substance use issues, then we put them on probation, and we give them conditions that say, do not use drugs, right? They couldn't do that day one before treatment, right? In no other field do we do this. And so I think we have to fundamentally change our theoretical perspective of corrections. It can't play this multiple tiered, deterrence model, retribution model, those. If we're really going to say that we are going to create equitable spaces for people, we need to have a system that once you enter it, that the entire design is for it to be you to exit successfully. And I don't think we have that. We don't have that system.
Yeah. Go ahead, Glenn.
I'm there too, Brian. And what I would say, and it's a little bit heady, I suppose, but I mean, I appreciate the tinkering perspective, because that's, relatively speaking, that's, I think, all we've done is we've tinkered with policies and procedures and laws and things like that. And what tinkering does is makes us feel like we've changed some things when we really don't. What we're not changing are what people think and what organizations believe and what we think. And we have to see the people that we serve in corrections, for example, we have to start with seeing them as human beings. And that's the problem, is that we don't see other people as human beings. We see people as objects and as obstacles and as threats. And so we have to get to like that really basic place of just seeing people as people. And until we see people as people and not threats and obstacles, all the stuff that we change around laws and policies and tinkering stuff like that don't really take their expected results or the intended results, because we still continue to see them as threats and objects. So the world I would like to see is to like change people's mindsets and beliefs and organizational thoughts around just what are we trying to, like, seeing people as people first. Because if we can really get to that level, then the policies and the procedures that sit on top of those beliefs then take their intended effects. And that to me is really the root of a lot of the things that the system that I would like to see is just seeing people as people. And that's harder work. That's long-term work. And that's things like changing a law or a policy here and there isn't going to be really efficacious at doing. And that's harder work. And that gets to what Brian is saying, is like punishment is a policy, but it sits on top of a mindset and a belief that is, we can punish away substance use or whatever. It makes us feel good because I feel like I did something to punish this person for, having an addiction problem or something. But so we change a punishment policy, but we still believe that punishment is the way to like deter somebody from having a behavioral health problem, for example. So we've got to change mindsets and hearts, and that's at the individual level and the organizational level, and that's harder work.
Yeah, so I think Brian and Glenn have hit on something like this idea of exit planning. So this thought that once we have delivered the accountability piece, we start working on exit planning and getting people out of the system. I think that's really helpful. But for me, equally, I think as a principal, we have to maintain this idea that science is going to drive us. I know there are a lot of really passionate people and a lot of well-intended people, but I think if we don't allow science to drive the work that we do in this space, we could end up with a lot of well-intended people creating policies and systems and structures that replicate disparities and bias in a different way. Because I think we're all subject to bias, and I think we really have to think about how we can use science. And I do think there are adjustments to the way that we've done research that we need to make in our efforts to build this new system. But I think we have to keep in mind how science can inform us and really push us through this next period of development.
I love that. And we are a research funder here at Arnold Ventures, so that resonates very much with me, Charles. I think doing the research without the principles is where, I think, at least some of my issues with it comes. We got to have those both sort of hand in hand to point to the directionality, or, what are we doing it for? I will be skeptical and wholeheartedly endorse Glenn's position, but I'll be the skeptical voice here and say, okay, that's a beautiful world, but right now, what are we going to do about the world that we're living in, and the one where we are so polarized about our beliefs about people, about their autonomy, about who's responsible for what and why. And this week is has been sort of a case in point of that, honestly. So I am focusing, yes, let's build toward that world. But right now, what is the research and advocacy about eliminating those barriers to reintegration? What is the research and advocacy to make fines and fees more fair, or to have the justice system funded in an equitable way? What is the research and advocacy around flipping that paradigm that Brian sort of referred to, of how do we support success rather than catch people? And that's kind of the back end, but like coming in, we're not asking the question, why is this person in front of us in the first place? And what can we do as an alternative? Accountability. The other book I have on my desk is Until We Reckon, which just talks about, the role of trauma and how we can better meet the needs of people who've been harmed by crime, and recognize that trauma often is what's underneath somebody showing up in the first place. So treatment for substance use disorder, yes, but treatment for trauma, how are we taking that person and doing the correcting? That paternalist, you can argue with language. I love the question in the Q&A, by the way, so I hope we can get to it about language.
Yeah. Well, I was going to make a segue, actually.
Yeah. Well, and so, I have a whole, we are focused on policy change because we know that where people find themselves is conditioned by the context, and the things that we can change with impact sort of in the near term are policies, knowing that that's not going to solve the whole problem, though. And Glenn's point is the right one. It's like, when are we going to see each other as brothers, sisters, neighbors, and so forth? And that's, a generational project.
Yeah. Hey, Faye, can I offer one thing though? Because I think, we've talked a lot about the people we serve and do, but I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind and think about is the people who are doing the work. And I think we have to think about the talent management side of this and the HR side of this, because most of us aren't going to get a new staff tomorrow that certainly understands all of this and wants to do work differently. But I think as, I guess, a profession, we have to begin thinking about how we train or retrain or help people understand work in this way, and how we build systems that educate and provide the skills necessary to work differently. I know one of my really long-term mentors is in the process of building a program that will support people in her agencies acquiring the skills necessary to do this. And I think that's a huge part of this, because as you change policies, you're dependent upon people to follow those, and depending upon people to want to work that way. And the way Glenn said, this is about changing hearts and minds. When people close the door and have interactions with clients or individuals under supervision, then I think it's up to them to really make a decision how they're going to interact with those people. So I think that part of this can't be left out, how we build systems that really help people work differently.
Charles, to that point, I know, Faye, you want to transition, but
That's okay, keep going.
I want to follow this up in that I think we have, and let me be really clear, and I think many of you know me, like, I believe in quality interventions. I believe that we have an incredible opportunity to change the trajectory of people's lives, and we should not take that willy-nilly and just be doing anything. We should follow the science. I also believe, though, that we have taken fidelity too far. We've taken fidelity of instruments and fidelity of models way too far. There's no evidence to support that reading a curriculum to someone word for word that someone else wrote is going to change behavior. It's just not engaging. None of us would. Imagine being on this panel and we all pre-wrote our statements and we just read them to you. But we have people out there who say, to do fidelity, right, to do this model right, we have to do it with scripts. We have to do it with why. And I 100% agree with you. And I don't know if you support this, but in the context of, which is, we can't remove the people from the work. Like, we've got to take care of the people who take care of the people. And to do that, we've got to tie to their passion. What happens in an office can't be scripted. I can't, as an administrator, I could never figure out the number of times an individual needed to be seen. I just can't. It's impossible, right? If I really truly believe proximity matters, right? And I do. I believe that people closest to the problem have the solutions, and the people who know the people's names on supervision should be the ones driving how many times, when, where, and what they're being seen for, not an administrator in a room covering their ass because they want to have a 4-to-1, a 4 contact a month policy, like there's something magical by a calendar month. And I think we've got to get away from this idea that it's like, I really think, if you want to boil down from my perspective, I really think we're so worried about optics and about lawsuits and about liability that we're afraid to let people do their jobs.
So of course, you know, this conversation is dear to my heart because I have spent the majority of my career primarily in the field of probation and parole, thinking about this issue about how to help the workforce help work better for clients, but also for themselves. But I'm wondering, I'm going to go to the question in the Q&A is if, you know, so many of us have started to use the term criminal legal system in terms of criminal instead of criminal justice. Many people have moved away from using language like offender, inmate, you know, probationer, to really talking more about those as statuses and not identities for particular people. What are your thoughts about this in terms of a segue to get to, I think, you know, Glenn used the terms hearts and souls, but a way of helping the system maybe begin to use language as one of those stepping stones to getting to social justice, or, you know, rethinking how we think about individuals involved in the criminal legal system. So,
from my perspective, Faye, it 100% matters. And I was really impressed with the University of Delaware's research, and I was really moved by it about the degree to which language matters and the real outcomes associated with stigma. I mean, real measurable outcomes on the health side with impacts in engagement in treatment, successful completion of treatment, positive drug tests, mental health interference, stuff that we in a justice system call, you know, not completing probation successfully, the stuff that leads to revocation and reincarceration and recidivism. There are very measurable impacts with people who experience the stigmatized effects of being involved in either substance use, mental health, or the justice system. And, you know, what I learned from the University of Delaware through the JQuinn initiative was that language impacts stigma, and its stigma is changeable. And that, you know, some people view like person first language as like this really, I don't know, shallow kind of intervention, but the way we think is because of the language that we use, and stigma and language matters, and it's changeable. And so I think the way that we talk and the way that we interact at the water cooler, in the hallways, and in our trainings, and all the things that we do, it absolutely matters. So it can change the way that we think. So I think it matters, and it's not insignificant. So something that we're working on in Colorado, and I think it's very important.
So Glenn is referring to the work by Valerie Earnshaw, and also a gentleman by the name of Ben Howell, who's at Yale. And the two of them have been working quite a bit on this issue about stigma and how being involved in the criminal legal system stigmatizes people, but also has an impact. And to the point of the panel, as part of the JQuinn initiative. So I'll do a little plug for our initiative here that's funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. We've also funded Kelly Moore, who's at Eastern Tennessee University, in developing a curriculum and testing a curriculum for correctional officers, probation officers, and judges on stigma in their workplace. And her work is very fascinating. But I'm going to have Cameron put the link. So for those on our panel or in our audience who are interested in hearing that discussion that Glenn mentioned, I'll bring that to your attention. Other thoughts about this language? I know I've been scolded, to be honest, by some pretty prominent reform people who say, why are you calling it criminal legal system? Why aren't you calling it criminal justice? Because it's a justice system. We've had some pretty hefty discussions about why this change in language, in my perspective, is important. But what does the panel think about it?
Well, here we've made some shift in language, and I think the term we use now, the language that we use now, is basically individual under supervision, to again go back to status versus a stigma that we put on a person. And I think the effort is really around trying to humanize the experience and recognize the humanity of the person. And I think for me, it's about matching that with the services we provide, because it's one thing to use the language, it's another thing to create the system around them that supports change and supports exiting the system. If all you do is create a language change, then I think we're stopping short of where we are. So I would say it's probably, from my perspective, necessary, but insufficient in terms of the full picture of what has to happen.
Exactly what I was going to say, so double click on that. Necessary but insufficient, and it's about respect. Eddie Ellis, may he rest in peace, talked about, please call me by my name, please use person first language. So I think that's I think probably fairly accepted here. And the question, to be fair though, is about criminal legal system. And I think this one's a little bit harder because it's not, sort of about dignity per se, but about either the promise or the how far the system has fallen short of those promises of justice. So that's where I feel like that call is coming from. Is this really it's a legal process and it doesn't deliver justice. And I think, that's part of the discussion today is, do we grapple with that, or do we continue to sort of believe that the system as it is delivers justice for those who have committed harm and for those who have been harmed? And I think, my answer, I guess you could probably guess what my answer would be. But I also think about, we have to hold both of those concepts in our head. We have to know that right now it's not doing the work of justice, but we also have to work toward an ideal of that. So, I haven't come down on a particular side. I think there's real reasons to keep that hope alive, but also to recognize the reality. That's probably unsatisfying, but I'm just going to say that.
Well,
so I'm all for evolution. I'm all for evolving our language and understanding our impacts. I was someone 10 years ago who argued 100% against language change, and I've learned, like I've grown over the last 10 years. If you looked at my PowerPoints from 10 years ago, they had offender written all in them. And you'll look at them today and they do not have that at all. Even in academic language, like I submit journal articles and they rewrite, they say you can't use in first person language, and you can't use they as a singular pronoun, and I'm pushing back on that. Now I won't submit to journals that make me change my language to use offender as a descriptor. But I also do not subscribe to criminal legal system. It's one that I just can't. I believe we have to hold true to what we want. And I'm perfectly good with saying to someone, you're an individual first. You're a person first. But what I want is, I want a system that is just. And I think we are short, to me, my personal opinion is we are shorting that, and we are running the risk of just being reflective and not beacon. And I think our system needs to be a beacon. We're never going to be 100% just, but I think we need to continue to strive for it and not just be a set of laws, but understand that our laws are applied to people and that we need to have justice involved. So I continue to call it the criminal justice system and refrain from the criminal legal system for those reasons.
Yeah, I think of the times, Faye, I think you and I have talked about this once before, as I'd imagine people were having this conversation in the 70s when they were thinking about taking homosexuality out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. They took out gender identity disorder out of the DSM. And they probably had these same conversations, and they were probably just as controversial. But it's these conversations that have to happen because at the time the DSM was the state of the art for psychiatry, and they had tough conversations to say, are we going to take homosexuality and gender identity disorder out of this manual as our kind of ethical professional standard for psychiatry? And it's these conversations that have to happen in order to kind of make forward movement on those things.
So, in our prior session to this one, we had Rob Norris, who is a professor who does primarily work in the area of wrongful convictions, and he doesn't like to use the term miscarriages of justice, but I asked him this question, and I'm going to ask you also this question, is how much does the public care about reforming the criminal legal system, criminal justice system, and how is it that, we can help the public understand, like really do public information about how our system works matters to the quality of our society?
I'm going to jump into this one and say, I don't think they care very much. Polling for midterms has it ranking, I don't know, 10th out of issues that people care about. They care about their pocketbooks right now. And so our strategy has been taking this to policymakers directly. Sure, really understanding what the public thinks and wants to happen in terms of reform, but just being more targeted about it. It's not to say it's not, crime, of course, is topping the charts in terms of what's in the media and what the narratives are that are part of, political debates and so forth. But in terms of what moves people to vote, what moves people to get out, it's not a top issue. So I think that's important to know. People think, there's a lot of crime going on out there, but they personally feel safe in their neighborhoods. They're like, not my neighborhood. It's the sense of, it's happening out there. There's a fear, I'm out of control. Particularly if the person in party is not aligned with your beliefs. So we see kind of a flipping. If the Democrats in power, Republicans feel less safe, and vice versa. So it's sort of a rough time to be changing the narrative at a macro level, and we just kind of roll with it. But I know that's what I was like. Oh man, I probably shouldn't have started here. But
No, I agree. I agree 100%, and that's the uphill battle that people like in my position that we face, because we have to go through legislatures and they have to go through their constituencies and their constituents have to go through the general public. And that's part of the problem that we face in trying to get healthy change moved, is that the public doesn't know, and because they don't know, they don't care, because they get their information from TV and TV tells them what they believe. And the stuff that they see on TV influences what they think about the justice system, and they don't care. They just think they sweep the problem under the rug, and they get their Ring doorbell notifications that say, hey, somebody snooped around in my truck, and they say, oh, that happens in my neighborhood. They didn't know that happened, but it's not until they get their Ring doorbell that they realize this is happening, and their eyes are open about stuff, and they just don't care about reform.
I want to jump back in and say, there, I sounded very skeptical and hopeless, but I don't think that's the end of the story, because I think the people who really do care can be organized and show up and make their power known. And that's families of people who have been justice impacted, people who are formally justice involved, and the workforce too. You know, we really, and we're working on this too. When families say to one of the chats, my loved one doesn't have their medication, or I'm hearing about this, and they can get that into the right hands if they can organize into a group that that shows up on lobby days, or that, you know, takes their concerns to a legislator that will listen to them. That is powerful. So I think there are ways around this, like, you know, is this a big ticket issue for people? I didn't want to be a total downer.
Julie,
Well,
what do you think? I'm curious, what do you think, where do you think proximity comes into that statement, right? So that if we think about everything that we do as a society, it's, are we proximate to it, right? Like, so think about race relationships. We know that in most situations, right, there's some studies that show a little bit different, but in most situations, integrated neighborhoods have less racism than segregated neighborhoods because of proximity. People that need to use the healthcare system think it's broken. The people who don't need to use the healthcare system think that their healthcare insurance system works perfectly fine. Do you think it might be partly proximity, in that if you're exposed to it, you're like, holy shit, this is jacked up. But if you're not, it's like, it must be working just fine. And I'm not interested in it because I have other things I'm proximate to.
Well, related to the proximity issue, you know, given the fact that, you know, 25% of the adult population in this country has had a little taste of the criminal legal system, criminal justice system, you know, I've often wondered whether we should ask those folks to communicate with their social networks for a big public education campaign about what impact this has had on their lives. And I use in an example, you know, in my social circle, one of my friends' husbands was convicted of a white collar crime, had the pleasure of spending some time in federal prison and being on federal probation. And, you know, my friends basically were astounded how the criminal legal system worked, from everything from, you know, what the conviction or process was to everything that happens. And so, you know, we have a small group of people now who are more educated, not because that particular person, but I use that as an opportunity to say, oh yeah, this is kind of work I'm doing and helping to educate people. But I'm wondering if organizations like Just Leadership USA or some of the reentry advocates could take that on as a need to really help this public education piece, so that people might care, only because, you know, you never know who's going to get caught up in this particular process. So, any thoughts?
I think stories matter, and I think stories help. I think stories give life to numbers. So in as much as we're able to present numbers and talk to people about long-term impacts and even things like recidivism, I think when you pair that with stories, you get further. I think people want to hear about somebody like them, right? So you talk about similarity, proximity. I think if you can get people in their circle to start communicating about that, and I think if they can do it in a space that they feel safe, then that helps, right? You're not asking them to out themselves to an entire community. You're saying in your circle where people are less likely to pass judgment or to place some consequence on you sharing your story, then I think you can create an education campaign that would help people at least become more aware. But I think we as professionals have some responsibility to partner with those people in the way that you're talking about, Faye, to broaden that story into a systemic view, right? One person doesn't really paint the picture for the whole system, but if you can start with the story and build from there, I think you can make real progress if it can be done in a way that's safe for that person that's sharing their story.
Oh, half the people though had to lie on their resume to get their job. They don't have a prior felony. They can't come out and talk about, their involvement in the criminal justice system, or they're going to lose their job. So I think that's the tricky part. It's right. Like it's like mental health. It's like substance use. It's like all these things that with exposure comes stigma. And we've got to, Faye, I love your point earlier, like we've got to have a stigma campaign. We have an anti-stigma campaign. We've got to normalize sort of like, and your point's well heard, Faye, like a strong majority of people have had exposure to the criminal justice system, be it for themselves or a family member, right? So there's actually more people that have been touched by the criminal justice system than not at this point. Especially when you look at over police populations, and yet we're hidden. We're scared to talk about it because I think it is still so stigmatizing, and you just step back, right? Like, oh, well, you committed a crime. Let me step back because you must be this terrible person.
So a colleague of mine, Bruce Turnbull, basically as a question in the Q&A. So just so everyone knows, Bruce and I co-chair an advocacy group dealing with criminal justice reform for the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And so Bruce was interested in what people think about faith-based advocacy in this arena. And he uses as an example in our work, JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, we issued a statement on Jewish teachings and sacred texts that supports reform in how the current US criminal legal system operates, with an emphasis on trying to make people aware of the concept of repentance. So what are your thoughts about getting the faith-based community involved in meaningful ways here?
I would say that has been one of the strongest supporters, the faith-based community, of criminal justice reform historically. I think you all know the history of probation, the idea that you had a responsibility to your brother and that you were going to sort of be there for them. Today, redemption polls very, very well, and evangelicals, for example, support some of these reforms. And so Prison Fellowship is an organization that we have supported, and they've been sort of a long time advocate on the federal front for reforms in supervision, reintegration, prison, and so on. And so absolutely. I think both at the local and national level, faith-based groups are critical to supporting, reforms at any level. I'd also add the business community right now. There's a labor shortage, and they need to rethink their standards for hiring. And now they have a business rationale for doing so. So let's put the gas on that fire. But I appreciate Bruce's question, and I also think just this idea of the dignity as reflected in world's religions is just a very powerful concept that we should continue to lift up. Thanks, Bruce.
Agreed. And what I would add, it's been my experience here in Colorado, exact same things. And I think what I would just only be able to add is that it's helped to counterbalance what I would perceive as an outsized voice in the reform space around prosecutors, law enforcement, and victims community. It's helped to provide some balance to that, because our reform voice, historically in the 2000s, 2010 space has been really outsized by those actors. And so it's created some balance in our reform space that's been much needed. And it's, you know, that local business voice, the community voice, the faith-based community voice, that has really helped bring some balance back to our state capitol in terms of, you know, who gets kind of input into the reform space. And that's been really, really healthy for our state. So that's what I would add.
We have another question in Q&A that that basically is from someone who says, teaching criminal justice legal system courses at the high school level could impact societal views of the system and allow people to humanize individuals who are justice involved. Are there barriers to including such courses more broadly in high school curriculums across the country? I mean, I have to say, you know, we had some new neighbors move in about 2 years ago, and the young woman who was a high school sophomore was telling me about her social science project, which was on mass incarceration. And I was just like, it was very exciting. She was, you know, she was like talking about the injustice of it. And, you know, she was 14, 15 years old. But thoughts about maybe thinking about pushing down the education about what is.
I'll be the guy to say it. And as much as we politicize what happens in schools, that might be your biggest barrier. I mean, I'll be the one to say it. Right?
All right, I'm following right on your coattails there, Charles. I'm afraid that we would whitewash the criminal justice system and describe it as this really positive place that protects people and communities, and it has no harm, and like we've done with all the other things in social spaces, we've ignored the pain and harm and trauma that slavery has caused. We've identified and sort of created a Euro-American or Euro-Caucasian perspective of history. My fear would be that we would do the same with criminal justice, and that we would be teaching people that deterrence works, that we need, that there are people who need to be locked up. What would we be doing with death penalty conversations? And right, so my fear would just be the political side of infusing that into education system at this point.
Well, it falls into what Julie describes as our highly interesting political scenario that we're currently involved, you know, and experiencing in this country with all sorts of things. So I'm just going to ask this last question from the Q&A and then ask each of you to give some closing thoughts. So this particular person is a federal probation officer. So I think, Charles, it's directed first at you to think about. They indicate that many of us in this work preach to clients with substance use or mental health problems. And then by the same token, officers do not share their own experiences or health issues with coworkers. So how can leadership in such agencies broach this topic and encourage normalizing that even officers have such struggles? And of course, we've seen this in the medical field where, you know, doctors and nurses who have substance use disorders. I mean, the medical system has a very progressive way of helping people with substance use disorders that for some reason we haven't been able to replicate in other places.
Faye, I'll say this, like, I think as we work toward more inclusive workspaces and trying to normalize being authentic in the workplace and expecting or setting up situations where vulnerability is allowed. And I'm not talking about the kind of vulnerability where people are walking around oversharing. I mean, unreasonable vulnerability is allowed. I think you get to a space where the workplace becomes an acceptable place to present yourself as who you are. And in some of that, I think you begin to normalize discussions about life and about the impact of life on all the things that you do. And I think in some ways that sets us up to see ourselves as flawed and as human and as walking into this work with that, right? And I think that helps us work with each other better and helps us work with the people we serve much better. But I think part of it is on leadership to create that safe space or create that environment that allows for that type of work to happen.
All right, thank you. All right, any closing thoughts on our panel? I really do appreciate everyone's willingness today to talk about a difficult subject, but some closing thoughts?
I would like to say thank you very much, and also just say we've got a lot of work to do. I would love to see more research on understanding what policies or practices reduce disparities, what can repair harm, and what can restore communities. We don't have that kind of research. We have the micro, like what do we do with this person in this situation? But let's zoom out a little bit. And we need leaders, to Charles's point. It's so right that to take that on before we can even research it, right? Somebody needs to be willing to go out on a limb to try. And so the kinds of things that we are looking to support, Brian knows this very well, is research, action research, and participatory action research. Just to speak to the participation that is part of PAR can serve some of these social justice ends. We haven't been listening, so let's do more of that.
Thank you, Julie.
For me, oh, go ahead, Glenn.
No, go ahead, Brian.
I was gonna say, for me, I'm excited. I think we are at a point in time where more and more people are recognizing the institutional and sort of structural problems that our system has, both from the social justice side and the criminal justice side. And I think there are movements afoot. I think we're starting to think bigger than just the tweaking. I think we're thinking bigger around like the infrastructure. I'm talking to people a lot about sort of our systems weren't even designed for behavioral change, yet we're trying to drop these little spaces of behavioral change in, or these tools. And the reality is we need to recreate the entire environment for behavioral change. And I think there's momentum. So I'm actually hopeful, more so than I've been in the last probably 10 years, because I see, with hope, you need agency and pathways. And I see both. I see that we're starting to gain agency and we're starting to develop clear and understandable pathways forward.
Thank you.
I agree with all that, everything that both said. And I would just add that we have to get better in the justice system at implementation. If you look in the implementation science literature, you see success rates as low as 5%, and the best that you see is 30% at implementing new initiatives. And federal government and philanthropic organizations have pumped hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into new initiatives. And we've just got to get better at implementing the things that we intend to do to get the results that we intend to do. And that requires rethinking what we do in leadership at organizational level and with implementation. And so everything that Julie said and everything that Brian said, and getting better with implementation, because we're just not very good at change. And so that's what I would add.
And Charles, you have the last words for our panel.
I'll just say I'm excited. I'm hopeful. I think we have people who are not only passionate, but willing to do the work to do it. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what happens as we recreate and rebuild the environment to do the work that we think needs to be done. So I'm excited.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, panel. This was really great. We really appreciated it here at ACE. You all are awesome and, clear leaders in the field. So thanks for your participation.